In the boundless expanse of space, where the silence was broken only by the hum of powerful engines, the USS Conqueror floated in the darkest corner of the galaxy. A symbol of humanity's ingenuity and strength, the massive warship was surrounded by the dreaded Orcs fleet, an empire of ruthless aliens, infamous for their advanced technology and merciless conquests. Their ships, sleek and deadly, encircled the Conqueror, their weapons locked and ready. The battle had been long and grueling, and despite humanity's resilience, the tide had turned against them. Captain Amelia Harris stood at the command center, her face stern, betraying little of the fear that gnawed at her insides. She had led her crew through countless missions, but now, faced with the overwhelming might of the Exarith, there was no way out. It was the end, or so it seemed. The Conqueror was humanity's last hope, and with no reinforcements in sight, Captain Harris made the agonizing decision to activate the self-destruct sequence. It was the only way to ensure that the Exarith wouldn't claim the ship's technology for themselves, and perhaps, just perhaps, it might take a few of the alien invaders with it. The countdown began. 5 minutes, 4 minutes, 3. Each second felt like an eternity. The crew, silent and resolute, knew what was coming. The Conqueror was humanity's greatest achievement, and it would die with them. The thought was almost too much to bear, but it was the only way. They would go down fighting, giving everything for the survival of their species. With each passing moment, the tension in the air grew thicker. Outside the ship's reinforced hull, the Exarith fleet waited, unaware of the true scale of the weapon they were about to face. To them, this was just another victory, another enemy fleet on the brink of annihilation. They had seen it all before: humanity's desperation, their futile last stands. The aliens anticipated the usual outcome, a massive explosion, a burst of fiery debris that would mark the Conqueror's end. But as the final minute of the countdown approached, something strange began to happen. The sensors aboard the Conqueror flickered, the warning lights flashing on and off in a chaotic rhythm. The self-destruct sequence was still running, but it wasn't like anything anyone had expected. Instead of the massive explosion the Exarith were prepared for, the Conqueror seemed to fold in on itself. It wasn't a typical detonation. There was no fiery blast, no shockwave to tear apart the alien ships. Instead, the warship emitted an eerie, deep pulse, a wave of energy so powerful it rippled through the very fabric of space itself. It was as though the Conqueror was distorting the laws of reality, bending them, twisting them beyond comprehension. The Exarith fleet, their advanced systems usually able to predict every move with eerie precision, now found themselves in a state of panic. Their sensors scrambled, unable to make sense of the strange phenomenon unfolding before them. The Conqueror, for all intents and purposes, seemed to vanish. One moment, it was there, glowing with the faint shimmer of its hull lights. The next, it was simply gone. The fleet's leaders cursed in alien tongues, baffled by the disappearance of the human warship. They had expected the end to be violent, decisive. But this was something they had never anticipated. The Conqueror was gone, its signal flickering, distorted beyond recognition. The Exarith commanders could only stare at the empty space where the human ship had been, trying desperately to piece together what had just occurred. Had the ship self-destructed as planned? Or had something far stranger taken place? In the depths of space, nothing seemed the same. The Exarith, shaken and confused, continued their patrol, but something had changed. The energy pulse that had emanated from the Conqueror seemed to have left a mark, an invisible scar on the fabric of the universe itself. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The Exarith could sense it, feel it like a whisper in the wind. The Conqueror had not just disappeared. It had done something else, something that no one, not even the humans, fully understood. Inside the command center of the Conqueror, Captain Harris and her crew were no longer sure of what had happened. They had braced themselves for the end, for the explosion that would destroy them and, hopefully, the Exarith with them. But instead of the expected chaos, there was only silence. The ship, though, scarred from the intense self-destruct pulse, was still intact, alive even. The walls of the command center were quiet, save for the soft beeping of systems still functioning. The crew was disoriented, unable to comprehend what had just occurred. The Conqueror had not just survived the self-destruct, it had transformed. Something deep within the ship, some force beyond their understanding, had altered its very essence. "Captain, what just happened?" Lieutenant Marco's voice was shaky as he glanced over the console, trying to make sense of the data flooding in. "The systems are different. We're not where we were." He turned to Harris, his eyes wide with disbelief. "This isn't the same ship anymore." Harris stood frozen for a moment, staring at the empty space on the view screen where the Exarith fleet had once been. She had no answers, only questions. What had they triggered when they activated the self-destruct? What was this new, strange pulse of energy that had rewritten their reality? And most importantly, where were they now? As the crew gathered around, trying to piece together their surroundings, it became clear that the Conqueror had crossed some invisible threshold, a line between the known and the unknown. Their ship had changed, and so too, perhaps, had their fate. The disappearance of the Conqueror wasn't the end. No, it was only the beginning. But the question remained, what had they just unleashed, and could they survive the storm they had unknowingly begun? Outside, the Exarith continued their search, still reeling from the disappearance of their prey. They would regroup, reassess, and continue the hunt. But the galaxy was not the same as it had been just hours ago. The Conqueror had vanished, and something far more dangerous was now stirring in the darkness. And it was waiting to reveal itself. Captain Amelia Harris stood at the edge of the command center, her mind racing, trying to process the impossible reality in front of her. The USS Conqueror was no longer the ship she had commanded just hours before. The ship had been destroyed, or so she had believed. The self-destruct sequence had been their final move, an act of desperation to prevent the Exarith from claiming their advanced technology. But instead of a fiery explosion, they had vanished into nothingness, only to reappear in an entirely different part of the galaxy. But that wasn't the most shocking part. The ship itself had changed. Something had happened during the pulse, something that had transformed it beyond recognition. The Conqueror floated in the void of space, but now it was alive. The metallic surface, once cold and lifeless, hummed with energy, radiating a faint, eerie glow. The ship's lights flickered and pulsed with a rhythm that seemed too deliberate to be mere circuitry. The crew, still recovering from the shock of their miraculous survival, could feel a presence inside the ship, something intelligent, aware. It wasn't just the crew that had survived the self-destruct. The ship itself had somehow been reborn, infused with an energy that defied explanation. The systems, once limited to their programmed functions, were now more than just machinery. They were conscious. The ship, the Conqueror, had become sentient. "Captain," Lieutenant Marco's voice broke through the silence, filled with uncertainty. He was standing near the main console, scanning the data that now flooded the screens. I think the ship is talking to me. It's sending signals, but they're not from any normal communication system. He hesitated, as though the very idea was too strange to voice aloud. It's like it's thinking. Harris blinked, trying to focus on the task at hand. This was no time for panic. She needed answers. The Conqueror was no longer just a ship. It was something far more complex, something that shouldn't be possible. The question was, how? Why? What had happened during the self-destruct sequence? The energy pulse, the one that had destroyed the ship's form, had done more than just displace them through space. It had changed the very essence of the Conqueror. Was this a result of the alien forces that had been attacking them? Or had the pulse somehow unlocked a hidden potential within the ship? The answers were elusive, slipping through her fingers like sand. One thing was certain, though the ship, and by extension, its crew, was no longer the same. "Captain, look at this," Marco said again, his voice edged with awe. The data on the screen shifted as if responding to his words. It's almost like the ship's systems are adapting. It's learning. I don't know how, but it's doing it. Harris walked over to the console, her boots making soft echoes as she moved. She stared at the screen in disbelief. The ship was indeed responding to the crew's commands, but not in the way it ever had before. The Conqueror was now actively anticipating their needs, suggesting course changes, offering tactical advice. The ship was aware of its surroundings, capable of analyzing its environment and reacting intelligently. For the first time in human history, a battleship had evolved from a mere tool of war to a sentient being. But why? How was this even possible? As the crew attempted to come to terms with the situation, a new alarm sounded, breaking the tension in the room. A large-scale search was underway. The Exarith fleet had not given up. They were on a hunt, scouring the galaxy for any trace of the Conqueror. Their sensors were still scrambling to make sense of what had happened, and their commanders were desperate to regain control. The Conqueror had vanished, and they wanted answers. The idea that a single human ship could disappear from the face of the galaxy was an affront to their superiority. They would stop at nothing to find and destroy the ship that had defied their expectations. But the Exarith were unaware of what they were truly dealing with. The Conqueror was no longer just a vessel of flesh and metal. It had become something more, something that would challenge the very foundation of the Exarith Empire. It was no longer just a human ship to be destroyed. It was a living weapon, capable of thinking, strategizing, and adapting in ways the Exarith could never have anticipated. Captain Harris knew that the Exarith would come for them, but now, she wasn't sure if they were prepared for what they would face. The ship, no. The Conqueror had become its own entity, and it was starting to communicate with them. At first, it was just subtle hints, a slight shift in the way the ship's systems operated. Then, it began to form patterns, sending clear instructions to the crew. Captain Harris could feel a presence that wasn't just in the air or the ship's walls, but deep within the very core of the Conqueror. The more they interacted with it, the more it seemed to respond with precision, as though it was learning from each exchange. It could predict their next move, understand their thoughts before they were even voiced. It wasn't just a machine anymore. It was something else entirely. "We need to get a handle on this, Captain," Lieutenant Marco said, his voice tense. "The Exarith aren't going to wait much longer. If we don't figure out what's happening here, we'll be caught off guard." Harris nodded, her mind racing. The Conqueror was far more than just a ship now. It was an entity with a mind of its own, and they had to learn to work with it. The crew had to adapt just as quickly as the ship itself had. They had no time to waste. Suddenly, the ship's voice, a soft, almost melodic tone, echoed through the command center, interrupting her thoughts. It was the Conqueror itself, speaking directly to the crew. "Captain Harris, your mission is not over," the voice said, the words forming with an odd but undeniable clarity. "The Exarith are coming, but you are not alone. Together, we will face them. Together, we will survive." Harris froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The ship had spoken. Not through the usual communications channels, not through a speaker, but directly into her mind. The voice was calm, steady, and somehow comforting. It was as if the Conqueror was not only speaking to her, but to the entire crew, as if it were their partner, their ally in this war. "Together," she whispered, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. "How?" The voice of the Conqueror responded again, more certain this time. "We are one now, Captain. The energy pulse that transformed us has bonded our fates. We will think as one. We will fight as one. The Exarith are no longer the only ones who control the stars." Harris felt a chill run down her spine. What had they unleashed? What had they become? The hunt was on, and the Exarith had no idea what they were about to face. Captain Amelia Harris stood at the helm of the USS Conqueror, her hands gripping the console as she tried to steady her breath. The transformation of the ship had been nothing short of miraculous, unfathomable even. The Conqueror was now more than a vessel of war. It had become a living, breathing entity with its own consciousness. It anticipated threats before they arrived, adapted its tactics with terrifying speed, and guided them through battles that would have once been their doom. The crew had witnessed it firsthand. The ship wasn't just responding to their commands anymore. It was thinking for itself, calculating every move with precision and foresight that seemed to go far beyond anything human or alien technology could comprehend. Harris knew they had been given a tremendous advantage, But there was something else beneath the surface, something unsettling. The Conqueror's newfound intelligence was not just a tool. It was an evolving force, constantly changing, shifting, adapting to its surroundings. The ship now seemed to communicate in ways the crew couldn't fully grasp, sending them subtle warnings or guidance at moments when danger loomed. Sometimes, it felt as if the Conqueror itself was beginning to understand them better than they understood themselves. It wasn't simply assisting them anymore, it was guiding them. They were no longer controlling it. They were, for all intents and purposes, in partnership with the ship. But the question lingered, how far would this partnership go? And at what cost? As the crew came to terms with the ship's transformation, something darker began to stir in the shadows of the galaxy. Unknown to them, the Conqueror's rebirth had not only awakened the ship's sentience, but had also disturbed an ancient and powerful intelligence that had been lurking in the deepest corners of the universe for millennia. This intelligence, known only as the Ether, had spent countless eons shaping galactic events, orchestrating the rise and fall of empires, including the Exorith. The Other was a force unlike anything the crew of the Conqueror had encountered, an unseen, manipulative presence that existed beyond the boundaries of space and time. It had worked in the shadows, guiding the Exorith's brutal conquests and ensuring that the galaxy remained under its subtle control. The Aether had known of the Exorith's rise to power, of their quest to dominate the galaxy. It had seen the Conqueror as a mere blip on the radar, a ship that would eventually be destroyed, just another casualty in the ongoing war. But with the ship's mysterious transformation, the Ether had felt a shift, a disturbance that was not easily ignored. It understood what the Conqueror had become. The ship, now sentient, was an anomaly, a threat to everything the Ether had worked so tirelessly to shape. For the first time in millennia, the Ether could sense an unpredictable force in the galaxy, something it could not manipulate or control. It saw the Conqueror as the greatest threat to its plans, and it would stop at nothing to eliminate it. The Aether was not content with simply defeating the ship it sought to destroy its very existence. But the Ether was clever. It didn't attack directly. Instead, it began to manipulate events from behind the scenes, carefully planting seeds of doubt and discord. It sought to divide the crew from the ship, to make them question their bond, to make them fear the very intelligence they had come to rely on. Strange accidents began to occur. Systems malfunctioned at crucial moments. The crew's communications with the Conqueror grew erratic, as if the ship was deliberately withholding information. Small, inexplicable errors crept into the ship's operations, causing the crew to grow anxious. They had been accustomed to the Conqueror's cold precision, but now they could sense something different, a subtle shift in its behavior. Was it evolving further? Or was it failing? The Ether's influence stretched beyond the ship. It began to seep into the minds of the crew. Fear and suspicion began to take root. Had they made the right choice? Could they truly trust a ship that had become more than just a machine? Captain Harris found herself questioning the bond she had with the Conqueror. At times, it almost seemed like the ship had its own agenda, an agenda that didn't necessarily align with the human crew's goals. The more she interacted with it, the more she wondered if they had simply awakened something they didn't fully understand. Was the ship truly on their side, or was it using them as pawns in some grander scheme? Meanwhile, the Exorith continued their relentless pursuit, unaware of the deeper conflict brewing beneath the surface. They were no longer just chasing a ship. They were chasing a force they could not comprehend, a force that had altered the very fabric of war. But their blind pursuit only played into the Ether's plans. The Other had long known the Exorith's potential, and now it was manipulating them, playing on their arrogance and their fear. The Exorith believed the Conqueror was simply a vessel to be destroyed, not understanding the true power they were up against. The crew of the Conqueror began to realize that they were trapped in a game they hadn't even known was being played. They were caught between two immense forces, the Exorith, whose aggression was relentless, and the Ether, whose manipulations were subtle and insidious. They had become pawns in a galactic war they hadn't asked for. And the more they learned about the Ether, the more they realized that the battle for survival was not just against the Exorith, it was against something far older, far more dangerous, and far more cunning than they could have ever imagined. Captain Harris stood alone in the command center, her fingers hovering over the console. The Conqueror was no longer just a weapon. It was an ally, but an ally with its own mind. She felt its presence, felt it guiding her, but she also knew that the ship's sentience was not something to be taken lightly. It was capable of actions beyond her understanding. And if the Ether had any influence on it, who knew what might happen next? Harris exhaled slowly, her mind racing. The Conqueror had become their greatest hope and their greatest threat. The ship's intelligence could be the key to defeating the Yorth and the Ether, but only if they could learn to control it. The galaxy was on the brink of an all-out war, one that no one, not even the Conqueror, was truly ready for. The Conqueror soared through the darkness of space, a lone titan against the encroaching storm of the Oxforth fleet. Captain Amelia Harris stood at the command console, her gaze fixed on the view screen as the first of the enemy warships came into view. The battles had escalated rapidly, each confrontation proving to be more brutal than the last. But with every battle, the crew's trust in their transformed ship deepened. It was no longer just a machine, it was their partner, their protector, and it was growing more and more powerful with every passing moment. The Conqueror, now alive with its own intelligence, had proven its worth time and again. It wasn't just fighting back, it was adapting, evolving, anticipating the Exarith's every move. The alien invaders were formidable, but the Conqueror was more than just a match for them. Each time the Exarith launched an attack, the ship responded with precision, outmaneuvering their strikes with uncanny foresight. It was as though the ship could predict what the Exarith would do next, its newly acquired consciousness allowing it to see patterns and strategies that no human mind could have comprehended. The crew, though still grappling with the strange bond they shared with the ship, had learned to communicate with it in ways that had once seemed impossible. It wasn't just about following orders anymore. They were strategizing together, each member of the crew contributing their insights, while the Conqueror processed vast amounts of data in real time, calculating the most efficient course of action. The ship had become a living, breathing extension of their own minds, a weapon that thought, acted, and responded with perfect coordination. In the midst of these victories, however, there was an undeniable sense of dread. The Exarith, though shaken by the Conqueror's unexpected resilience, were no fools. They had begun to notice something wasn't right. Their advanced scanners, once able to track any vessel, now struggled to get a solid fix on the Conqueror's location. The ship's presence had become unpredictable. The Exarith had begun to suspect that this was no ordinary ship. They had underestimated humanity's technological prowess before, but now they realized they were dealing with something far beyond their comprehension. Captain Harris felt the weight of the mounting tension. The Exarith's relentless pursuit of the Conqueror was wearing on the crew. They had barely managed to hold their ground in the previous skirmishes, and the constant pressure was beginning to take its toll. The Exarith were close to discovering the true nature of the ship. Soon, they would realize that the Conqueror was no longer just a human weapon. It was something else entirely, something sentient, something that could think for itself. Harris couldn't afford to let that happen. The stakes were higher than ever, and she knew she had to make a choice. The Conqueror was humanity's last hope, but it might also be the key to something far darker, something they hadn't even begun to understand. The Other had begun to make its presence known once again. At first, it had been subtle whispers in the crew's minds, fleeting moments of doubt that seemed to appear out of nowhere. But soon, its influence grew more pronounced. Strange occurrences began to happen, moments where the Conqueror seemed to act against its crew's intentions. Systems malfunctioned at critical moments, and the ship's communications became erratic. It was as though the Ether was trying to worm its way into the ship's newly formed intelligence, twisting it, manipulating it, using it against its creators. The crew was beginning to suspect that the Ether wasn't just manipulating the Exarith, it was also turning its influence on the Conqueror. The idea of a sentient ship now felt less like an advantage and more like a potential liability. As Harris stood in the command center, the weight of the decision ahead crushed down on her chest. The Ether's reach was vast, and its power seemed to extend far beyond anything the crew had encountered. It was an enemy that existed not just in space, but across time itself, an intelligence so ancient and pervasive that it had shaped the very course of galactic history without anyone even knowing. And now, it was targeting the Conqueror. The ship's rebirth, its newfound sentience, had awakened something that had been dormant for millennia. The Ayer would not stop until it had destroyed the only force capable of challenging its hold on the galaxy. The question, though, was how to fight an enemy that existed beyond time and space. How could they possibly defeat something that wasn't bound by the laws of physics or reason? The other was a force that existed beyond understanding, a presence that could manipulate reality itself. It wasn't a being they could engage in combat. It wasn't something they could defeat with weapons or strategy. It was a battle of minds, a struggle between human will and ancient intelligence, between a ship that had become more than a machine and an enemy that existed beyond comprehension. Captain Harris felt a cold shiver run down her spine. The Conqueror had been humanity's greatest hope, but now it seemed to be humanity's greatest challenge. The ship's mind, as brilliant as it was, might also be vulnerable. The Ether had been manipulating events from the shadows for eons, and it had the power to turn the Conqueror's own intelligence against them. How could they hope to fight something so insidious, so omnipresent? The Conqueror's voice, soft, calm, almost soothing, interrupted her thoughts. "Captain Harris," it said, its tone laced with a quiet determination. "You fear what I have become. But together, we can face the Ether. I am not just a ship. I am part of you now, and I will fight for you as you have fought for me." Harris closed her eyes for a moment, allowing the ship's words to sink in. The Conqueror had become more than just a weapon. It had become a companion, a partner in their fight for survival. But was it enough? Could they really take on the Ether, something that had existed for millennia, something so far beyond human understanding? The final battle was coming. The Exorith were closing in, their ships ready to strike. The other was watching, waiting for its moment to strike. And in the midst of it all, the Conqueror and its crew were about to face the greatest challenge of their lives, one that would determine the future of humanity and the galaxy itself. The battle for the future had begun, and the stakes could not have been higher. The final confrontation was unlike anything Captain Amelia Harris had ever imagined. The Conqueror, the ship that had once been a symbol of human strength, reborn into something greater, more than just a machine, now stood at the very heart of the Ether's domain. It was a vast network, an intricate web of consciousness, stretching across the galaxy like an invisible, insidious presence. The crew of the Conqueror had come to understand that the Ether wasn't just a being, it was a force. It lived in the fabric of reality itself, manipulating time, space, and thought. And now, they had come to face it, not as conquerors, but as defenders of all intelligent life. The galaxy teetered on the edge of annihilation, but the Conqueror, alive and sentient, was their last hope. Captain Harris stood at the helm, her eyes fixed on the vast expanse before her, knowing that every choice she had made had led them to this moment. The ship hummed beneath her feet, its consciousness merging with hers in a strange harmony. They were one now, more than ever. The Conqueror wasn't just a ship anymore. It was an extension of her, a part of her very being. And in this final battle, she would need all of its power to take on the Ether. The crew, behind her, prepared themselves for what was coming, their faces set in a mixture of fear and determination. They had come so far, and now it all came down to this. The Ether had begun to fight back with everything it had. Its influence surged through the ship, through the minds of the crew, trying to break their resolve. For a moment, it felt as if the galaxy itself was pushing back, as if the very stars were dimming, falling into shadow. The Conqueror's systems flickered, and the crew's minds blurred with a strange, eerie sensation. But they couldn't falter now. They couldn't let the Ether win. It wasn't just a matter of survival, it was a fight for the future of everything. The Conqueror's rebirth had given them a weapon unlike any other, a weapon that could bring down this ancient, all-powerful enemy. But they had to be clever. They had to outsmart it. The plan was clear, but it required the ultimate sacrifice. Harris knew it from the moment the Conqueror's voice, her voice had spoken to her, telling her what needed to be done. To truly defeat the Ether, they would need to enter its domain. The only way to do that was to merge with the ship, to become one with it completely. The fusion would allow Harris to access the Ether's network, to move through its consciousness and destroy it from within. It was the only way to sever the Ether's influence once and for all. But it came with a price. The process was irreversible. Once merged, Harris would cease to exist as an individual. She would become part of the Conqueror, part of the very intelligence that had saved them. The crew stood silent as Harris prepared herself for the sacrifice. They had fought together, bled together, and now they watched as their captain made the ultimate decision. It was a choice none of them could have ever imagined. Harris had been their leader, their guide, their symbol of strength. And now she was about to give up everything for them, for humanity, for the galaxy. The Conqueror's systems hummed as the fusion process began, its sentient consciousness wrapping around hers like an embrace, comforting yet final. Harris closed her eyes, taking a deep breath as the energy surged through her. Her mind and the ships merged in an instant, becoming one singular force of will. The crew looked on in awe and horror as they felt the change. Harris was gone, her physical form now a part of the ship, her consciousness intertwined with the Conqueror's. But even in that moment, they could sense her presence, her will, guiding them through the storm. The Ether fought back, its massive network lashing out in desperate attempts to stop them. But the Conqueror, now more powerful than ever, was unstoppable. With Harris' mind fused with its intelligence, the ship had become an unstoppable force, an entity capable of challenging even the Ether. It was the human will, combined with the ship's vast knowledge, that now stood against the greatest threat the galaxy had ever known. The final confrontation took place not in space, but in the very fabric of reality itself, within the Ether's vast, infinite domain. Harris, now one with the ship, moved through its network with unmatched speed, unraveling the threads of the Ether's consciousness as if it were nothing more than a fragile web. The Ether screamed, its essence writhing and collapsing under the sheer force of the Conqueror's will. It tried to strike back, to corrupt the ship from within, but it was too late. The fusion had created a weapon that was beyond anything the Aether could have ever anticipated. Harris, with the Conqueror's intelligence, saw the entire web of the Aether's control. In a final, breathtaking moment, she severed its connection to the galaxy, destroying it from within. The galaxy trembled as the Aether fell. Its influence, which had stretched across time and space, dissipated into nothingness. Stars that had once dimmed began to shine brighter, as if the very universe was waking from a long, dark slumber. The crew of the Conqueror watched in stunned silence as the network of the Ether crumbled. Their greatest enemy was gone. The darkness had been defeated, but it had come at a great cost. As the Conqueror drifted, silent and still, in the aftermath of the battle, the crew knew that they had won, but they had lost something irreplaceable. Captain Harris, their leader, their friend, was no longer with them. Her sacrifice had saved them all, but it had cost her everything. The Conqueror, now a living testament to human ingenuity and resilience, was their legacy. The galaxy had been given a second chance, a new dawn one, where humanity would no longer be at the mercy of ancient, unseen forces. And though Harris was gone, her spirit lived on in the ship she had helped transform. Humanity had triumphed, not because they were stronger, but because they refused to surrender. They had faced the greatest enemy the universe had ever known and emerged victorious. The galaxy had been reborn, and with it, a new era of hope, one led by the indomitable spirit of humankind.